Okay, so we are so excited, Adult Ed is so excited to bring you Joe Ader this morning. I know most of you already know Joe, but he's bringing a little bit different message today than what we've known in the past with Family Promise. I found a little, well, his secretary sent me a little bio information, but I found a little bit more online, so I'm going to read that to you because there is more. There is more. So Joe Ader, visionary, team builder, leader. Joe Ader brings practical experience and strategic direction to organizations wishing to engage those living in poverty. Joe is the Chief Executive Officer of Understanding Poverty, which trains and consults with organizations wishing to better serve people living in poverty. Mr. Ader has more than 20 years experience. I don't think you're that old.
I am. There's some wisdom marks here.
More than 20 years experience innovating and designing programs and services for serving the poor and homeless. His clients include PepsiCo, Frito-Lay, Prison Ministries, PayPal, Dallas United Way, the Village Church Initiative, Tarrant Area Food Bank, and hundreds of nonprofits, schools, and churches. His role as Executive Director of Family Promise of Spokane has allowed him to innovate new programs to end homelessness for families with children and have allowed Family Promise of Spokane to become one of the fastest growing providers of homeless services to families in the United States. Mr. Ader's previous positions include Compassion Ministries Director for the Six Stones Missions Network, Missions Pastor at the Village Church, Executive Director of Serve Denton in Denton, Texas, and President of Habitat for Humanity in Waco, Texas. Additionally, he has served with the Funda Niños Orphanage and Casa de Libertad
That's close. Yeah.
in Guatemala. He has spent decades researching, testing, and teaching others the best tools and techniques for serving the poor. And I found a few more. He is a collective action expert, a change catalyst, a poverty alleviation consultant. Now, we know here at Covenant we are a do something church. But I think you should hang on to your chairs because I think the message we're going to get today is do something else or do something more.
All right. Thank you so much, Sherry. All right. I appreciate it. That was a great introduction. Warm welcome. I thank you guys all for having me here. I know several of you in the room, and many of you have been involved with Family Promise for a long time. I've been with Family Promise for 6.5 years. I moved here from Texas. That's why a lot of those references were Texas-based. And did not move here to work with those in homelessness. I was consulting nationally on poverty issues. And we moved here, and about a month later I met Steve Allen. How many of you know Steve Allen, the former Executive Director of Family Promise, who is just a ball of energy. And we met, and almost instantly he was like, you need to be here, you got to be doing this. And so I came on staff of Family Promise. We opened the emergency walk-in shelter for homeless families at that time. And then it's just grown like crazy. I became the executive director 3 years ago. And we've just had massive, massive growth in the work that we do at Family Promise. And we've implemented and been implementing some of the stuff that you guys will see today, and some of the things that we'll talk about, and we do similar trainings with our staff. But just to give you a reference point on at least homelessness, these are the statistics of the homeless that were rehoused last year by the different shelters in Spokane County. These are only the ones that report their numbers, so there's a couple not on here like UGM, because they don't report statistics. But Family Promise rehoused more than twice as many homeless than any other shelter. Actually, 42% of the homeless that were rehoused last year were rehoused through Family Promise in Spokane County. So I'm really proud of that. That's a really big deal for us. But let's get into what we're going to be talking about today. And what we're going to talk about today is poverty. And there's a couple of things to know when we talk about poverty. And I'm going to throw this right up at the front here. Poverty is relative. Poverty is relative. And what I mean by that is poverty is relative by location and by time. So, for instance, if you make $50,000 a year and you live in Spokane, Washington, what's most likely your socioeconomic class? Middle class, poverty, or wealth? Middle. If you make $50,000 a year and you live in Manhattan, New York, what most likely is your socioeconomic class? Poverty, middle class, or wealth? Poverty. If you make $50,000 a year and you live in South Sudan, Africa, what is your category? Wealth. So poverty is relative by location. It's also relative by time. So my parents bought their first house for $7,900 in Southern California, in Orange County, California. Same house today is worth almost $700,000. So poverty is relative by time as well. Poverty occurs in all races and in all countries. I want to restate that. Poverty occurs in all races and in all countries. We often have an image in our mind of what poverty is or what race people that are poor are. It occurs in all countries all the time. This work is about economic diversity and not cultural diversity. I'm going to kind of re-say that. There are a lot of things that are involved with poverty around race and around gender, and there are big influences. There are entire college curriculums built out on each of those two subjects. I'm not going to cover a lot of that today. We only have about 35 minutes, so we'll be cooking today through this, but I did want to point out that there are things that do influence poverty and all that around race, and I'll just show you one here. So this over here is a map of Spokane. This was a map that was developed in 1929 and was in existence and in use in Spokane County until 1969. And this is the insurance map. So the red areas are areas where they were marked as hazardous because you could not, or they were marked as hazardous, and so mortgage lenders and insurance companies would not insure or lend in those red-lined areas. This is what you call redlining. There are a number of reasons for redlining. You're in a floodplain, there's an earthquake hazard, there's volcano mudslide, or you're built on a landfill. Those are all hazardous reasons for somebody to invest. But from 1929 to 1969, one of the other categories to mark an area hazardous was its proximity to Negro populations. So this is the official description of Liberty Park neighborhood from these maps from 1969. The territory immediately adjacent to Liberty Park is slightly better grade, but its proximity to the largest Negro concentration in the city precludes a higher grading. So that means for 50 years, roughly, there was no mortgages or insurance or investment in those communities, which we are still seeing the impacts of today. You can kind of see the areas of town that are the poorest are also the areas of town that were redlined for that 40-something year period. And so that does impact us today. We still see the results of that today. African Americans are 5 times greater percentage representation in our shelter than are represented in our community. And same thing with Native Americans. And so there's overrepresentation of minority groups in poverty. So I just want to say that right at the beginning. This work is not going to dig that much deeper into that. I just wanted to point that out. This work is concentrated on generational poverty, and it's different. There's actually 3 different types of poverty when you have large definitions of poverty. There is situational, generational, and extreme. So the definition of situational poverty is this. I lose my job, I'm thrust into poverty for a certain time period until I regain my job, and then I'm back out again. That's situational poverty. That makes a certain mindset. There's a different mindset that's developed when you are in generational poverty, and that works like this. My grandmother was poor her whole life. My mother was poor her whole life. I'm probably going to be poor my whole life. Those are different mindsets there. And then there's extreme poverty. Extreme poverty is you earn less than $2 a day. And that type of poverty has actually been decreasing in the past 20 years significantly. It's less than half of what it was 20 years ago around the world. Extreme poverty. The U.S. is one country where it's actually growing. So there is a widening gap between poverty and wealth that is continuing, and we will see what the ramifications of that are, but that's something that just needs to be noted. And then you're going to hear me say things like, this is often the case, you will tend to see this, things like that. That's because this training is built off of patterns, and there's always exceptions, because we're talking about people. So even if you know somebody that's an exception in your mind, don't get too hung up on it. We're talking about generalities here because we have to, because of time and speed and expediency of what we're going to be talking about. Okay, that being said, how do we define poverty is an important thing to define. Actually, there was not a definition of poverty in our country until, 1964. So in 1963, November 22nd, 1963, something really important happened in the history of our country. Who are my history buffs? What happened that day?
Assassination of Kennedy.
John F. Kennedy was assassinated, November 22nd, 1963. So Lyndon B. Johnson becomes president. His very first State of the Union address, he declares war on what? Poverty, 1964. There was no definition of poverty at that point. The government did not have a definition. And so they were like, wait, we just declared war on something that we can't define. And so they searched throughout the government. They found a lady named Molly Orshansky. She's now called the mother of poverty. She hates that, or she hated that while she was alive. But and she worked for the Social Security Administration. Prior to that, she worked for the Agricultural Department. And she had tried to create a formula for determining where benefits should start. At what level of income should benefits start? And her formula was based off of 2 reports from the Agricultural Department. So the Agricultural Department had one report that said, this is the amount of food that somebody will need based on their family size. So it's called the grocery basket method. So this is the amount of food they will need. She took that amount of food and she said, okay, this is this dollar amount by family, this is this dollar amount by family, this is this dollar amount by family. And then there was another Agricultural Department report that said families tend to spend 3 times what they spend on food on everything else. Okay, great. So she created a formula. 3 times the cost of food by family size equals poverty line. The federal government adopted that as the definition of poverty, and it still exists today. So that's the definition of poverty. That's how they determine the poverty line. 3 times the amount of cost of your food by your family size. Now, what's the problem with that since 1950? Not everything goes up at the same rate. Yeah, the price of food has gone up a little bit. What has gone up a lot? Housing. What else has gone up a lot? Gas. What else has gone up a lot? Medical. Transportation. Everything else has gone up significantly faster and higher than food. But we still use that same definition. So a family of 4 earning less than $26,500 a year is considered poor. But if you earn $26,501, Guess what? You're not below the poverty line in the United States. All right, so 25% of the U.S. population is children, 35% of the U.S. population in poverty is children, so below that line. The median net worth of the top 10% of the entire country is $833,600. So if you own a house and a couple of cars, you're probably approaching the top 10% of our whole country, believe it or not. The median net worth of the bottom 20% is $7,900, everything you own. And so, but I pointed out at the beginning, poverty is relative by location and by time. So any monetary definition of poverty is probably going to be not accurate at any point in time. Yes?
Bad if I ask questions and slow you down.
No, you can ask questions.
So this may be coming, can you tell us why the percentage of children in poverty goes up higher
Than the percentage of their population? Yeah, so there's a growing number of, there's a direct correlation between poverty and the size of the family. Whereas the wealthier you get, the smaller the family sizes get. And that's been shown many times, not just in the US, but around the world. So the more affluent a community is, the less number of children that they have. And so there's kind of this inverse correlation with that. Good question. Okay, so this training is typically several hours long and we're going to fly through it. So I wanted to talk, I want to do a demonstration real quick. So in middle class, say you're in middle class, you walk out in the morning to get into your car, you put the key in the ignition, you turn it, nothing happens. What do? Who do you call? AAA, right? You call AAA because you paid for the insurance to have AAA. You call them, you say, my car won't start, will you come out, help me out, or fix it? Or you do what? Call a friend, get into your other car, right? And you drive away. But let's say you call AAA, they come out, they say, we can't get your car started, we'll tow it for you to a mechanic shop. They tow it to a mechanic shop, you get there, you put a credit card down because you have access to credit in middle class. You say, okay, fix my car. And then you got to get a ride to a car rental place. So the company that rents cars that picks you up comes and picks you up, takes you to a car rental place. You put your credit card down, you get a rental car, and you're on your way. Whole thing is a huge hassle for like 3 hours. But your transportation problem stays a transportation problem. It doesn't bleed over into many other areas of life in middle class. And so middle class is kind of this, I call it the pizza slice mindset. We like our slices very clear. So much so that we will even describe different parts of our lives as different things. So how many of you heard somebody say, that's my home life? And this is my work life, and that's my church life, right? As if they are different segments rather than all intertwined. That's very common in middle class. Think of it like, I don't know if any of you have the kids or grandkids where the food can't touch. Like if the food touches, it's contaminated. So that's my son. He's like, the broccoli touched chicken. I'm out. Like there's no more. We're not doing that. Middle class is very much that way. It's very segmented and very clear slices. So let's do the same demonstration, but now you're in generational poverty. You walk out in the morning to get into your car. First of all, what type of car do you have if you're in generational poverty? Junker, yeah, a beat-up car if you have a car. If you have one, it's a beat or a junker. One time in California, somebody said a disposable car. I was like, we have those now? That's a different level than I have. But let's say, same thing, you walk out in the morning, put the key in, turn, nothing happens. Turn it again, nothing happens. Now you're in generational poverty. What do? Who do you call?
Your brother.
You call your brother, exactly, yeah, or your friend, or Uncle Ray, right? So in middle class, we call AAA. In poverty, we call Uncle Ray. right? And you say, hey, there's something wrong with my car. Can you come over here and help? So Uncle Ray comes over, he takes a look at it and says, you know what, I don't know if I can do anything about this, but I'll try to work on it this weekend. I'll give you a ride to work today. So we're going to do this demonstration here. Would you mind standing up and helping me for a second?
Sure.
What's your name?
Joel.
Joel. Thank you, Joel. Will you hold that? So we've got a transportation problem. You can show everybody else there. And I'm going to have you hold this in your hand as well. Okay. So that's a transportation problem. Now, Uncle Ray gives you a ride to work today, and now you're spending the rest of the day trying to figure out how you're going to get home and who's going to pick up your kids from school. And then you don't know when your car's going to be fixed again. So your transportation problem starts to cause problems where? At work, yeah. So your transportation problem, do you have jobs that you can show up late for when you're in poverty? No. So what happens when you show up late too many times? You lose your job. Dave, would you stand up and hold this for me? So your transportation problem becomes a job problem. And when you don't have a job, what do you not have anymore? Money. And so when you don't have money, what can you not pay for? Food, clothing, housing, right? So if you can't pay for housing, what happens? So your transportation problem becomes a job problem, now becomes a housing problem. And so where do you go when you lose your housing? Shelter, but not first. Where do you go first? Relatives. Yeah, you go and you stay with a relative. You stay with a relative. And so, could you hold this for me? This says relationships. I'm going to have you give you that as well. So your transportation problem became a job problem, becomes a housing problem. Now it becomes a relationship problem. How many of you have had visitors that have stayed too long? Right? Benjamin Franklin said fish and visitors begin to smell in 3 days. Right? So your transportation problem became a job problem, becomes a housing problem, becomes a relationship problem. And when it becomes a relationship problem, this is where things get really bad. Because in poverty, relationships is how you survive. It's your relationships that fix your car. It's your relationships that watch your kids. It's your relationships that help you get by. And so when you start losing relationships, it starts getting really difficult and you start having these issues. So this is healthcare. And if you can't get the right treatment, you start sometimes, this is often the case, notice how I'm using that term often, you go to this. This is substance abuse. And often that will lead to this. Crime. And so the point I want to show here is that whereas middle class, everything is segmented, in poverty, everything is interconnected. It's all touching. It's like a ball of yarn. So let's hear it for our sign holders. You just put the screen down, just drop it, and let it stay across the audience. So how many of you were getting stressed out just with this screen coming across the room? Did it cause a little bit of tension? It's crossing over the top of you. Our folks that are in generational poverty are in this situation all the time. Incredible amount of stress. Stress has triggers that influence everything else. Here's the other thing I want to point out with this. We entered on this demonstration at transportation. We could have entered at job. We could have entered at housing. We could have entered anywhere. We could have entered at medical. In all of these things, same things happen. And so you see this constant movement within poverty. And so the definition of poverty that I'm going to use today is this: the point at which one lacks the daily resources needed for a stable environment. Lacks the daily resources needed for a stable environment. Notice how I said resources and not money. There's a lot more resources than just money. And you can't solve every problem with money. There's a lot of problems that need to be solved in other ways. So, All right, you guys can jump in with questions at any point. I'm gonna click this next one. All right, so how does this impact me? How does this impact us as a church here, Covenant? How does this impact me? So from the late 20s until the year 2000, there was a movement of poverty from rural to urban. You move from the farm to the inner cities, to the core. And in 2000, a switch started happening where you started seeing movement from urban to suburban of poverty. And this shift has been happening and continues to happen since 2000. It first started in the major cities and now is happening in smaller cities. So Spokane's about a decade behind other cities, Dallas, Los Angeles, things like that. But I'll just show you a picture of what this looks like for Dallas. So in the year 2000, this is the concentration of poverty in Dallas, Texas. So that's where it was pretty concentrated, historically poor communities. Right through the swath, and this is also the floodplain of the Trinity River. Those are the poorest communities in Dallas. Look by 2012 what that map looks like. Looks like it exploded, right? Like there's shrapnel of poverty spreading out to the suburbs and things like that. This is now happening here in Spokane. So last year were more homeless students, kindergarten through 12th grade students, outside of the city limits of Spokane and Spokane County than are inside the city limits. In some surprising statistics, Meade School District had the second highest homeless student count for the first time last year, which it was always been Central Valley before that. So 377 homeless students in Meade School District last school year. And nobody's thinking about homeless kids in Meade, right? That's not the top of, when you think of Meade, that's not what you would think of. So this is a pretty consistent thing that we're seeing. It's because the urban cores are getting expensive. And what used to be single-family neighborhoods are being knocked down, becoming high-density condominiums, which is pushing those that are, traditionally poverty communities out further and further out from city centers. And so you're seeing more homelessness and poverty in places that you've never seen it before. And that's continues with the national trend there. All right, so how long do we have, just so I
As long as you want.
All right. Yes, sir.
I just, that expression I heard somebody that it can happen to anyone.
Correct.
Have you experienced people that can tumble all the way from middle class, just say like a health problem or an injury or something like that?
Yes.
Could,
Yeah, it's super common. It could happen to any of us. Medical issues are a very big indicator, as well as domestic violence, and that happens in every socioeconomic class. But there's usually a triggering event that causes some type of break in relationship. If you had people you can lean on, you'd go and stay with them. So whether it's because of bad things that you've done, sin that you've done, sin that's been done to you, or circumstance, there's some type of broken relationship, and so people end up on the streets because there's nowhere else for them to go. So one of the things that has to happen is you don't solve homelessness with just housing. You have to rebuild a network of relationships. Otherwise, you're one paycheck away, one medical issue away from ending up back in that state. And so, yes, it can happen to anybody. The family that we had stayed the longest, one of the longest stayers in our shelter, that just was surpassed this past year, but prior to that, there was a woman in our family stayed 244 days in the emergency shelter. Single mom with her kids, master's degree in social work. So, yeah, the connection point doesn't make sense. 50% of the adults that show up to our emergency shelter are working. So over half of our adults are working the day that they show up to need shelter right now. There's a lot bigger things here. So what's the cause of poverty? Okay. So this is probably the biggest discussion in our community right now. There's newspaper articles written every single day about homelessness. There is a big political divide on this. And usually one of those articles or somebody that's making a statement is making an argument in one of these 4 areas. So then they go like this. This is a cause of poor individual behavior. You've done something bad or did not do something good, and so you're in this circumstance. So you'll hear this kind of argument, and it goes something like this. Well, if you just got a job, then you wouldn't be in this situation. Or if you stopped doing drugs, right, you wouldn't be in this situation. And so that's a mindset that's super common in the United States because we have this pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of mentality, this manifest destiny mentality. So this is the most common thing that we hear in the United States. It's you're doing bad stuff, and so that's why you're in this situation. Okay, so if you believe that that is the reason for poverty, then what are the solutions that you're going to create to solve that? What types of things?
Mental health treatment.
Mental health treatment, substance
Starting
abuse.
alcohol rehab.
Yeah. Yeah, some type of behavior modification, right? You're going to create programs and resources to modify poor individual behavior. There's another group of people that come in and they say, you know what, it's not poor individual behavior, it is lack of resources in our community. We have poor schools, or we don't have enough, we don't share enough resources. And so what happens here, if this is your thought? What types of solutions do you create?
Community programs, government programs.
Community programs, you start a nonprofit, you go to United Way, whatever, so that you take resources from one group and redistribute it to another group. So resource redistribution is kind of the focus in this category. Exploitation. People are poor because they're being exploited. There's payday lenders, there's sex trafficking, there's a number of different exploitation things. If you believe that this is the problem, what type of solutions are you going to seek?
Jail.
There you go. Yeah, law enforcement. This is a law enforcement. If people are being exploited, then let's arrest the ones that are exploited, or change that. And then there's a third area here there's just bad political and economic systems. So there's political and economic systems that exist that are suppressing a group or keeping a group down. So you hear this in the US with, hey, the requirements for Medicaid are this, which means that people have to be below a certain line to qualify, or things like that. You often will hear this around the world, that there's a dictator that's suppressing one of the groups of his people. So if you believe this is the problem, what type of solutions do you try to create?
Leadership change.
Leadership change, yes. Or law change. Or you create a government for the governments, the United Nations, right? The government for the governments to police the other governments. So these are all the most common things that are referred to as why poverty exists. But there's one common thing that runs throughout this as believers. What is that? All of these things can be traced back to sin. Right? They can be traced back to the fall. Every single one of these, whether it's individual sin, whether it's community sin, whether it's somebody exploiting somebody else, or the government systems, there's all traced back to the fall. So if you remember Genesis 1 and 2, the earth is great, it's beautiful, everything is perfect, right? So at this point, poverty doesn't exist. Genesis 3, sin enters the world. God comes to Adam and Eve, and what he says to Adam is really telling. Because he gives curses, right? He gives curses to the serpent, he gives curses to Eve, right? What was the curse that was given to Eve? Pain in childbearing, yes. Which, I don't know, there's pain in child raising too, I'm just going to say that. But to Adam he says this, cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground. Prior to this point was there work. Did Adam have work? He did. What was Adam's job? Take care of the garden. Yes. Name the plants. Right. We're really important. Naming is really important to humans, by the way.
Bill, that was before we rotator cut.
There you go. But yeah, it was perfect back then, so you didn't tear rotator cuffs before that point. But at this point, work becomes hard. Work becomes difficult. It opens the doorway for disparity. So prior to this point, there was no disparity. There were no socioeconomic classes. There was just God and man. But then it opens up the doorway for disparity. And there causes this break in relationships. And notice how I'm talking about relationships a whole lot. There's relationships between you and God. And so rather than seeing God who he truly is and powerful, we start worshiping idols. And I'm defining an idol as anything that you hold above God, right? Anything that you hold here. Or we deny God's existence or authority. Just outright deny that God exists. Or there's some type of syncretism. Syncretism is just a term where you are combining different faith beliefs. So in Guatemala, I saw a Catholic priest holding a cross, sacrificing a chicken in front of a Mayan temple. Okay, that is syncretism. That is combining, like covering your bases. In the US, it's usually a lot more mild than that. It's like praying as you buy the lotto ticket. But there's some type of syncretism that happens. But there's also broken understanding of who you are, right? So we tend to have either a God complex or an inferiority complex as humans. If we have a God complex, everything revolves around me. I have to be in control in everything. So then if things are not going right, it's other people's fault because things are not going right for me. So we have this God complex. There's also an inferiority complex where everything is done to me. I have no control over it. It just happens and I don't get to control anything. Where does middle class and wealth tend to fall on the God complexes versus the inferiority complex? We tend to fall on the middle class on the God complex side. We are going to create the solutions for your problem, right? We're going to kind of ignore our own problems, but we're going to focus on how we can fix yours. Inferiority complexes, people in poverty tend to land there. And they often, here's another group coming in to tell me what to do. Another person telling me how to fix my problem. This is a big issue in missions. How we approach a community in missions is really important. Rather than us seeing we're all broken, no matter what socioeconomic class we come from, there's brokenness that exists across all of them. And so rather than coming in as equals, we tend to come in with a superiority-inferiority complex, which then perpetuates that divide. There's a broken relationship with others, selfishness, apathy, exploitation, and abuse that happens with the fall. And then there's a broken relationship with creation, materialism, exploitation, abuse, destruction. I can speak on this stuff a lot. There's a lot of sermons to be had here, but we're going to go fast through this. So, okay, so there's this brokenness. That brokenness rolls out, and we see the societal issues that we see today. We see poverty. We see addiction issues. We see homelessness. We see lostness. So what should we do? What should we do as believers? This is a mural that's downtown. It's called American Jesus. The artist is Daniel Lopez. He's right here. This is all done with spray paint, by the way. And it's painted on the building downtown. So what do you notice about this?
No face.
There's no face. The face is blurry. We have a tendency to not see Christ clearly in our communities, in our world, in our churches. In America, we don't see Christ really clearly. We kind of have this vision of like, you know, middle class Jesus with the coiffed hair and the white robes, you know, and striding up. This is a guy that was born a homeless child. He spent most of his life walking around with a group of guys that we would probably call a gang today. He was buried in a borrowed tomb because he didn't have enough money to die. Think about that. He rode into town on a borrowed donkey. There is a lot more that's related to Jesus that's connected to poverty than is connected to what we would consider middle class or rich in our community, in our society. So Jesus lived this poor man's life. Why? And then 2 Corinthians 8:9 says this, "For I know the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for our sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich." This is God. He has everything. He could have come in as the king, which is what the Jews were expecting him to do. Come in as the triumphant king, the wealthiest. They were expecting Solomon. And what they got was a homeless child from the poorest part of the country, a place that they said nothing good could come from that place. And so, of course, it wasn't who they were expecting. And then when Christ, his first public sermon, he opens up the scroll, he opens up to Isaiah, and he reads, and this is found in Luke 4, what he reads. This is his first public sermon. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor." To who? The poor. "He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives, recovering sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Very different mission than I'm going to take down governments. Wasn't wasn't the thought process. The thought process is, I'm coming here to serve those who are oppressed, those who are poor. A lot of times, and I'm a pastor, a lot of times in church, you will hear this talked about spiritual poverty. Oh, well, he's talking about spiritual poverty, not financial poverty. Maybe, except the Greek word for that is the exact same word for actual poverty. Street poverty, not spiritual poverty. And so, I think it's probably both. In all honesty, if you look at Christ's life, he shared the gospel and served. He spoke truth and healed. He did all these things combined, which means we should probably be doing these things combined, right? If we're following this example. So God sends his son into the world as a poor man, but lives a perfect life. Dies on a cross for our sins, and then is resurrected again. And gives us this mission of reconciliation. And what does reconciliation look like? It's God's love reconciling us by grace to a right relationship with Him. God initiates it, and we receive that. But then that changes how we see ourselves, right? We realize we're not God, but also everybody else is made in the image of God. And so everybody's valuable. But we're not valued above each other. There's our understanding of others. Selfishness becomes selflessness. Apathy becomes empathy, where we actually care about what others are doing. Exploitation and abuse comes for a seeking of justice and mercy. And then creation, we learn to steward what God has provided for us. I love your garden out here. I've been out in your garden a couple times in the past couple of years. But I love that type of growing, renewing, stewarding resources that we've been given. And this is what we are given as our mission as believers. This is 2 Corinthians 5:17 through 20. It says, "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he's a new creation. The old has passed away. The new has come. All this is from God, who through Christ has reconciled us to himself and then given us this ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and entrusting to us this message of reconciliation. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us." So what's an ambassador? What do ambassadors do?
I'll give you an old royal ambassador that.
Do they what?
This is from my upbringing.
Okay.
This is the definition for royal ambassadors, a mission group in Baptist churches.
Okay.
An ambassador is one who represents his king at the court of another.
There you go. Yeah, an ambassador goes to a place, a different place, and represents the king who sent him, or the government who sent them. So this is what we're called to do, to go to places that we're not from, communities that we're not typically involved in, and represent our king. Represent him in those places. So our role in that, and this is really important, there's a thing called, who knows what the golden rule is?
Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Who's ever heard of the iron rule? You've heard of the iron rule.
It's the heart and soul of what the Spokane Alliance does.
Okay, and what's the iron rule?
Do not do for someone else what they can do for themselves.
Don't do for someone else what they can do for themselves. This is probably the hardest thing when you're trying to serve others, because you want to solve it for somebody else rather than equip them with the tools that they don't have so that they can solve it for themselves. And so the way this looks out in a practical way is, rather than I'll make that phone call for you, it's, do you have a phone? Great, here's the number that you can call. It's, here, let me show you how to do this work so that you can earn an income to receive this. Now, there's times where there's emergency, and you have to respond in kind, right? If somebody needs to eat, they need to eat. That is not a time to be like, well, let's teach you how to fish, but you're starving today. You got to feed and then teach, right? There's times for this. But the iron rules mindset is not everything is a crisis, and not everything needs to be treated as a crisis. A lot of times we strip the dignity of success from people by trying to help them. And so we really need to be thoughtful with the way that we engage others, in the way that we serve, knowing that it's not on us, right? If the Holy Spirit leads you to do something, then acknowledge that and go in that direction. But if it's guilt-driven, it's probably not from God, right? If it's grace-driven, it probably is. And there's a difference between those two. I can guilt people into helping homeless children pretty easily. But that's not grace. That is not what we are here to do. You know, I could put up, just same like SPCA puts up the, you know, starving dog picture with Sarah McLaughlin playing in the background, which is fine, but there's only so much you could guilt somebody into something. What we really want to see is heart change that causes life change. And that can only happen through grace, not guilt. So all of these things get reconciled from this one thing. It doesn't mean that we only bring the gospel message. It means we bring good news and love and support at the same time. They go together. They're not separate. They are two sides of the same coin that all needs to be played at the same time. And we have to recognize that if this is true, if all of these things are caused from a result of sin, the root cause is sin, and these are side effects of that, not causes. They're side effects. So we've got to work on the root cause, which causes us to focus on love. Love for God, love for others in this, which is not a surprise why Christ gives us the missions that he does. I'm going to give you this verse, this section of Scripture, Matthew 25, 31 through 40. Probably one of the least preached on sections of the New Testament. And the reason why is it's theologically challenging. Because all of our different denominations have a really clear picture of what salvation is and how you're saved. In this particular chapter, it's Christ's own words, red letter, speaking about how God's going to separate true believers from those that are not. Sheep and goats is what it's called. And what is the determining factor of that? I wrestled with this I come from a Southern Baptist tradition. As a Southern Baptist pastor, I wrestled with this for a long time because it challenges my theology. But it really comes down to there is something that has to do with how we care for the least of these, how we serve others, which impacts not only now but also eternity. And this verse and these verses talk about it. I'm not going to go any deeper because it is theologically challenging. I'm going to let you guys do that on your own and talk to your own pastors and ministers here about that. But I do want to leave that verse with you as a way to challenge this. And then I'd be remiss if I don't talk a little bit about Family Promise because I am here. So for those of you that don't know, Family Promise is here to equip families and communities that end the cycle of homelessness. Although I did a faith-based presentation today, and I'm a person of faith, the organization is a community-based organization. It's not a faith-based organization. We were birthed out of networks of different denominational congregations. So we were birthed out of churches, and they've always been intertwined with us. Covenant has been a longtime partner of Family Promise for almost 20 years. And especially through the pandemic, you guys supported us in mighty ways. Barb would show up with donations, or Sherry, I don't know, at least once a month for the entire time the pandemic was going on. And sometimes those just brought light to us during that time. Even though it was like, you know, here's a bag with some diapers and some stuff in it, which was awesome and we needed that. Just the fact that you showed up when everything else was shut down was a pretty significant thing for us because we didn't get to shut down. Homelessness continued to exist. So we didn't get a break. It got worse. It got harder. And so I do want to share that. I want to thank you guys for your support during that time. These are the 3 areas that Family Promise works in. We work to prevent families from becoming homeless in the first place. A lot of people don't realize how much prevention work, rental assistance, and diversion work that we do. Last year we served 3,512 people through prevention.
Can you read it? Can you read it?
This is prevention. We prevent families from becoming homeless. This is shelter. We provide shelter for families that are experiencing homelessness. And we consider a family anybody that's caring for a minor child or who is pregnant. That's it. It doesn't matter if it's grandparents caring for grandkids or aunt and uncle caring for niece and nephew. If there's a kid involved in Spokane County, it's us. That's what we do. So we have multiple different shelters and shelter models now. We have not reopened the church rotational model, which is what you guys were part of originally. We are opening different ways for churches to come back in. We have a reverse rotation model where the church adopts the shelter for 1 week out of every quarter. So that's starting up. There's going to be a lot more volunteer opportunities in different ways rather than just doing the dinner and overnight host thing. And there's a number of different reasons for that, but that's what's going on here. There's not a lot of success in homelessness. We don't hear success a lot in homelessness in Spokane County, do we? We spent 7 months last year from December 4th of 2021 to July 11th where we didn't have to turn anybody away from shelter. For the first time in our 25-year history that we didn't have to turn any family with children away. There's a reason for that. The reason for that is because there's a formula with homelessness that has to work out. And that formula is this. The amount of people entering homelessness has to be less than the amount of people leaving homelessness for you to ever solve homelessness. It doesn't matter how big the shelters are that you build. It doesn't matter any of the other resources that you provide, substance abuse, mental health treatment. If the equation doesn't work out that less people are entering than people leaving, we're never going to get our hands around this. Luckily, we had a good chunk of government money that helped us prevent a number of people from entering homelessness, and we got people out faster than we ever have before. So we were actually at equilibrium for about 7 months, which proves that it's possible. We can actually end homelessness. It's not a requirement that we have homelessness in our communities. That is something that we're really proud of. Since July 11th, we've been over capacity back and forth for the past 7 months. So, but we did show that it was possible up to that point. And then the last thing is we stay with our families for 2 years after they leave homelessness to help them stabilize in their housing. And this is where churches, I think, in the future will have the biggest impact, is wrapping around families that are rehoused right when they get rehoused and building relationships that they then have stable networks of people that they can lean on and support through congregational settings. I think this is the one thing that we're never going to have enough case managers for, but there are enough believers in our community to truly love on people and provide a network of resources and relationships for them. Plus, it's the church's mission to go and make disciples. You can't do that without building relationships with other people. So, that's what I want to talk about today. I'll show you one more little picture here. This little guy was born into the shelter during the pandemic. Both parents were COVID positive the day he was born. That was our worst nightmare. We were afraid of that from happening. He ended up being fine, doing well. The reason why I'm showing you that picture is the largest single age group we serve is under 1 year old. So the largest age group we serve is under 1 year old. So when people are talking about homelessness in Spokane, the image that comes to their mind is an adult man. It's not a baby. But this is important to note, like this represents a significant portion of the homeless population. Families are 20% of the homeless population in Spokane County. And nobody's thinking about babies or talking about them. We happen to worship a God that was born a homeless child. Here. This is that baby when they got into housing. So there's that little one. This is their family, Ryan and Echo, the day that they got into housing of their own. And so we love to celebrate these types of moments. All right, questions? Yes, sir.
Do you have some kind of a rule that people can't come if they're on drugs?
We do not, actually. We take a stance that we'd rather have the kids safe in our shelter and be able to monitor parents. Our staff is trained to monitor inebriated adults. As long as the parents are still able to care for their child and are not causing a disturbance, they can come in because we want to have the kids safe. And then we work with the parents to get into the treatment programs that they need to get back onto their feet. Some of the programs we don't allow that. So like the church rotational program, everybody that would be in that one would not have addiction issues. But to enter the emergency shelter, it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If you're pregnant or you have a child, you can walk in there and receive help. Other questions? Yes?
Is Medicaid solve the issue of 65 and over from a homelessness standpoint? I noted that was very low as far as the statistically.
So that was just the family shelter population. So those are just grandparents that are caring for grandkids that are staying within our shelters. There is a growing population of seniors that are experiencing homelessness. And a lot of it has to do with learning how to adapt to the lifestyle change, which many of you, I see a few folks in here that probably had to adapt to, hey, I'm not working anymore, and my income was here and now it's here, and lifestyle has changed. There's a lot of different stuff. And then the medical issues that go along with just aging causes significant financial burdens. And no, the government does not catch up fast enough to resources that are needed there. So we do have a growing population in the country of seniors that are facing lost housing and things like that. There's been a lot of communities that have created homestead laws so that seniors' housing can't be taken away. But there's still a lot of work that needs to be done there. Yep. Other thoughts or questions? Okay, so let me leave you with this. You guys can reach out to us anytime. Hopefully this was enjoyable, insightful for you. We will be doing a longer version of this and focusing really on that first part, the string part, and homelessness in March as part of our Match Madness campaign. So if you want to go more, you have somebody else that, hey, you really should take part of this, we'll get that advertised out to you guys as a church so that you can encourage others to participate and see what we're doing there. We do have a matching campaign that's going on through March, aligned with March Madness, so it's called Match Madness. We've been getting corporate sponsors that will match any individual donations, and so I want to throw that out there. If you want to leverage those resources, get your money to go further as far as donating, March is a great time to do that because it's doubled or tripled depending on what you give. But getting involved will require all of us that are believers to, one, see Christ correctly, and then imagine how we would serve as if we were serving Him. So I encourage you, next time you see somebody that's homeless, or you think about it, or you hear a statistic, or you read a newspaper article, think about, if I was serving Christ, and that person was Christ, what would I want? What should I do? What would that look like? That could inform who we are and how we do what we do. Yes?
I'm just wondering, why did you decide to quit the program that we were involved in for so many years, where we pick up the people and they'd stay here for a week and so
Yeah.
forth?
We didn't quit it. It's definitely on pause. COVID caused it. Literally overnight, all the congregations had to pause. So we had to do something at that point. We've made some changes and identified some unique new ways of serving families through smaller site locations that have really proven to be very successful. And so we're re-looking at how do we do the congregational rotation. There are challenges logistically with it in a number of different ways. One, a lot of our churches are aging, and so finding overnight hosts was a real challenge with a lot of our different congregations. And then coming out of COVID, volunteers have not come back to any nonprofit, not just us, to any nonprofit. So there has to be a level of volunteers coming back into the organizations before we could get to a point to where we can logistically handle doing a rotation again. I love the rotational model, honestly. I like the fact that families are coming into congregational buildings. I would like relationships to be developed more between the congregation and the families. I think we can do that on site, on our sites, as well as on church grounds. It was, the rotational program is very successful. Families move slower through it, so there is a timeline that it takes longer when you're doing the church rotation for families to get into housing than it does when they're on a static site location. But the amount of involvement from the community is drastically more. We had 600 volunteers in 2019. By the end of 2020, we had 12. So massive change in the amount of volunteerism. And so I think everybody's trying to figure out what do we do now? There's a corporate sense of trauma that our congregations are dealing with as well. Many of them are financially right on the edge of not surviving, honestly. You guys are doing pretty good here, it seems, but there's a lot of congregations that just aren't. So that's why it's been slow to reopen the rotation.
Well, I think along with that, from what staff has talked about, the families maybe do better at a static site because they develop a sense of perhaps ownership of where they are. They're cooking their own meals. They are taking care of their children. When we were running, when they were coming to the church every night and going back during the day, that's a lot of upheaval.
Yeah.
Especially for toddlers, little ones, nap times, and then nighttime they're in a different bed. And when you've got young children, that can be, I think, more emotionally unsettling for them than being in one place all the time.
Absolutely, yeah. There's amount of trauma that comes with moving all the time. I would say the rotational model is better than the emergency walk-in shelter, which is the mass shelter, but not as productive as our smaller site locations. So we have actually 8 locations now. 5 of those are in houses that are just a regular house. Will house 3 to 4 families in a house at a time.
Do people donate? How do you get those out?
Yes, a mixture. We have had houses donated, we've had houses that we purchased, and we also lease a couple of mobile home units. And that was really a side effect of COVID. We did not anticipate doing that. When the church rotation shut down, our Hartson location, which was a house in the South Perry district, which was our administrative offices, we sent everybody administrative home and we said, okay, we gotta put these families somewhere, so we put them into that smaller site location. And then we saw those families leave at a rate of 95% into housing of their own from that smaller site location. So to put that into perspective, the average emergency shelter in Spokane County, 13%. So 13%, our emergency shelter at Family Promise does right around 50%, between 37 and 50% each year. And then we have this smaller site location where almost everybody, 95% are leaving into housing of their own, which got us thinking, these smaller sites are working better. Why? And can that be duplicated? And so that's really how we've been expanding lately. We're actually looking at some sites up north this year as well as in the valley. So there's a potential site in Deer Park, one potentially in Meade, and then Spokane Valley that we would probably open up these smaller site locations. And then we also do those because it keeps kids closer to their schools. So less bus time. We had a kindergartner from Cheney a couple years ago. The bus ride was 2 hours. So she's leaving the shelter at 5:30 in the morning, kindergartner, to get to school in Cheney, doing school, and then 2 hours back, and she's wetting herself. Like a kindergartner can't sit on a bus for 2 hours, right? So that's why we're going to expand to further county areas and try and keep kids closer to where they're going to school for most of the time. I know we're pushing up against lunch, and I'm a lunch person. Thank you guys so much.